Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to today's panel, From Commitment to Action, Realizing Your Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Goals. This is the third and the final session of YWCA Canada's Synergy Speaker Series on working towards equitable futures in employment. The series spotlights exciting equity initiatives, enduring challenges, and promising strategies to collectively reconfigure the way we work. This cross-sectoral initiative comes out of YWCA Canada's ongoing efforts to create inclusion in the Canadian labour market and attend to the diverse needs, the distinct barriers faced by women, two-spirit, and gender-diverse individuals across what is currently known as Canada. This project is made possible through generous funding by our supporter, the Future Skills Centre. Whether you're joining us for the first time or have been tuning in since the beginning of the series, we're so glad that you're in this space with us. Recordings for all the sessions will be made available, so I hope you check back on our YouTube channel. Today's discussion brings together a slate of speakers that have been leading with integrity and steering sector-wide change. My name is Jolyn Joseph, and I'm the Research Manager at YWCA Canada. I join you today from the ancestral and unceded homes of the Atakapa Ishak Nation and the Tapilam Coelutican nations of South Houston. At YWCA Canada, we acknowledge that the work we do takes place on and across the traditional territories, unceded lands, and current homes to many Indigenous nations. We recognize the harm that settler colonialism has perpetrated and continues to perpetrate on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And we commit to doing the work and that ongoing learning to dismantle these systems of oppression, of extraction, racism, and discrimination that we are all embedded and implicated in. As we engage online today, let's remember that these digital spaces that we occupy are often used as tools of oppression towards Indigenous women, racialized women, gender and sexual minorities, and people with intersecting disabilities and forms of marginalization. Let's do our best today to create a space where we can all safely and meaningfully engage. Now for some technical and accessibility notes. Closed captions are available to you in English. You can find this in the Zoom toolbar, and French live interpretation can be accessed via the interpretation channel at the bottom of your screen. We have a great tech support team supporting us today. Should you face any technical difficulties, feel free to reach out to Kristen and Arissa, tech support, over chat. You'll also notice that all participants have automatically their mics and their screens turned off for the duration of the discussion. You will still have the opportunity to engage with panelists even though your audio and your cameras have been switched off. We'd love to hear your questions or what is resonating, what you're grappling with at your workplace. So feel free to freely use the Q&A function during the discussion. My colleague Jessica Perrin will also be monitoring the chat box and the Q&A. A quick reminder, there will be a feedback form that launches right at the end of the session on your screen. We'd love if you could take a moment to reflect and offer some feedback that we can incorporate into further programming. A certificate of participation will be generated for everyone that has joined us today and completed all of the 3 sessions in the series. Now let me tell you a little bit about YWCA Canada. For over 150 years, YWCA Canada has worked to advance gender equity by responding to urgent needs in communities through national advocacy and grassroots initiatives. We are at the forefront of a movement to fight gender-based violence, to build affordable housing, and advance workplace equity. Today, we engage young leaders, diverse communities, and corporate partners to collectively achieve a safe and equitable Canada for all. Here's a brief agenda now, so you know what's coming up in our time together. I'll begin by setting the context with very few brief thematic remarks to frame the discussion, and then invite and introduce our moderator to share and their speakers to share their perspectives. After this, we will have time for audience engagement, so make sure you pop your questions in the Q&A during the session. So how do we ensure material, meaningful change in workplaces that have made commitments towards equity, diversity, and inclusion? We talk so much. There are so many think pieces on the daily about diversity, about equity and inclusion in the workplace. that EDI, JEDI, it can all feel like word salad or boxes for organizations to check. So how can employers authentically advance equality, equity, diversity, and inclusion? Well, our speakers today have been steering this change, have been leading those change, making waves, and questioning and unpacking what are gestures and what makes real impact. So it's time to dive into that conversation. And I am so thrilled, so honored to introduce our speakers today. Our moderator, Aniska Ali, is the Director of Philanthropy and Strategic Initiatives at YWCA Canada. Aniska is a social impact sector leader who has been lucky enough to spend the last 15 years of her career leading fundraising teams and initiatives in both local and national charitable organizations. We've been lucky to have her stewarding these initiatives. With an academic background in gender studies, she is most excited and driven and committed to finding ways to reshape philanthropy to be a revolutionary force, grounded in community care and equity. Take it away, Aniska.
Thank you so much, Jillian, and hello to all of you joining us. After the tireless work of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, women and gender diverse people, people with disabilities, and 2S LGBTQ+ people, employers and organizational leaders are acknowledging just how much of a priority creating equitable workplaces is. While meaningful changes have been made, the work continues to ensure EDI initiatives are more than words on a page and good intentions, and instead create real, tangible, and material change in workplace culture and employee experience. Today, we're going to dive into how organizations and leaders can move their EDI commitments into action. I am so thrilled to welcome our panelists for today's discussion, starting with Sharon Naguiso, the founder and CEO of Quake Lab, a full-stack equity and justice agency. Sharon specializes in a radical new approach to diversity and inclusion that is measurable, strategic, and based on a strong foundation of design thinking. A leader in empathetic community engagement and moving inclusivity from aspiration to action, Sharon is a regular contributor and panelist on CBC Radio and Television, Rabble.ca, Live 88.5, and CTV. An immigrant from Kenya who has worked and lived in Canada for 9 years, Sharon has worked across sectors with organizations in 11 countries. Thank you so much for joining us, Sharon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now for our second speaker, Sarana Sandy. Since November 2012, Sarana has held the position of CEO at Skills for Change, SFC, a charity that provides skills, development, employment, social services, and settlement support to over 16,000 immigrants, refugees, and underserved communities across 4 offices in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton region each year. Sarana's priorities are centered around planet, people, prosperity, peace, and partnership. I love that so much. To promote sustainability, driven by this passion for sustainable community development, she is currently pursuing a Master of Liberal Arts degree in Global Development Practice at Harvard University and is expected to be completed in summer of 2023. In her studies at Harvard, she is exploring how various factors such as policy instruments, social complexities, human health risks, ecological system dynamics, technological innovations, and financial models can contribute to sustainable development. Sarana has a Master's of Arts in Leadership and Management, an MBA in Human Resource Management, an Honors Bachelor of Arts in Leadership and Management, a postgraduate diploma in Public Administration, and a certificate in Human Resources Management, certificate in Strategic Perspectives on Nonprofit Management, a graduate certificate in Environmental Policy and International Development, and a diploma in HR Management. Sarana, so pleased to have you with us today.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
So let's get started. Our first question is for Sarana. At its core, what are the fundamental intentions of equity, diversity, and inclusion practices in terms of employment standards and overall outcomes? What are some examples of JEDI initiatives, changes, and actions that resulted in significant change for employees from equity-deserving groups?
That is really a great question. And there's so much I want to unpack with that. But first, I want to say congratulations to you on the series that you've been put forward. It's exceptional work. And thank you for inviting me to share a bit of my knowledge with you and the attendees. I think at its core, the fundamental intentions of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion really practices are to promote fairness and equality in the workplace, eliminate discrimination and barriers to opportunities, and it's geared towards fostering culture of belonging and respect for all employees. And so by promoting JEDI practices, I think organizations, they're really aiming to create diverse and inclusive workplaces, right? Where employees from all backgrounds could feel valued and respected and have equal opportunities for growth and advancement. Um, this is really critical to understand. It doesn't only benefit the employees themselves, because data has shown that it has very positive impacts on the organization in meeting its strategic business goals, including productivity and profitability, but also improved employee engagement, retention, innovation. So that's really valuable. So when organizations are on the EDI journey, they can make significant changes for equity-seeking groups with a number of strategic priorities. I think one of the first thing they can do is to focus on having diverse hiring practices. This is really key. So companies really need to implement policies and practices that prioritize the diversity in their hiring processes, and that includes setting diversity targets. They could use blind techniques for screening candidates. They can provide bias training to hiring managers. And through that work, this can lead to increased representation of underrepresented groups in workplaces across Canada. And it could also improve those companies' recruitment outcomes. And you would say, well, what does that look like? So really, an example of diverse hiring practices is, as I mentioned earlier, was setting diversity targets. And that could involve setting specific goals for hiring and promoting employees from underrepresented groups. And that could be women, it could be people of color, LGBTQ plus individuals, and people with disability, Indigenous folks. And organizations should set a goal of increasing representation, for example. So they can set a goal of increasing representation of women in leadership roles by 30% over the next 5 years. And so by setting these goals, these organizations can hold themselves accountable for creating a more diverse and inclusive workplace. But more importantly, they can track their progress towards achieving these goals. The second thing that I think organizations can do is really focus on inclusive leadership. And this is work that is critical. We are doing that ourselves, looking internally at Skills for Change, and we are conducting lots of training on inclusive leadership to ensure that we're practicing what we're pushing through on our employer partners. And inclusive leadership really refers to a leadership style that really promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion within an organization. And inclusive leaders really recognizes the unique perspectives and lived experiences and professional experiences and unique contributions of each member of their team, individual members of their team. And then they work to create environments that fosters collaboration, trust, and respect. So when focusing on inclusive leadership, organizations they can foster an inclusive culture by promoting leadership that values and prioritizes EDI. And so that also requires them to provide training to managers and EDI best practices. They need to incorporate EDI metrics into performance evaluation and goals of leaders. And they need to ensure that their leadership teams are representative of the diversity of the organization, that people who work there or their clients and the communities within which they operate. So for example, inclusive leadership may entail like training managers on best practices of EDI, which is really critical. They could train them on topics such as unconscious bias, cultural competence. They could train them on inclusive communication. And so when companies provide this training, their managers can develop the skills and then, of course, gain the knowledge that they need to promote EDI within their teams and to really make more inclusive decisions. And those decisions could be hiring or promotion and or supports. A third option for organization, which is really critical too, is they need to focus on accommodating and accommodation and accessibility. I mean, organization can and should provide accessibility measures to support employees with disabilities or barriers to participation in the workplace. And that could look like many different things. So it could be flexible work in arrangements, ergonomic workstations, or even ensuring that you have assistive technology. And by doing this, this can really help to ensure that all employees have equal opportunities to participate and to succeed in the workplace. And we've seen during the pandemic when we had remote work and the flexibility of different work environment and how that allowed people to navigate through change effectively. But it could also include the options, again, telecommuting, part-time schedules, or job sharing. Flexible work arrangements can really be especially important for employees with disabilities or chronic illnesses, or especially for us in the nonprofit sector where we have folks who have, are in a care work and have caregiving responsibilities. And Canada has a rapidly aging population. A lot of us will be taking care of elders and parents. So we need flexibility to ensure we can afford those care. It does allow employees to manage their work and personal obligations more effectively. And the fourth thing is build employee resource groups. Organization can establish ERGs, and that'll provide space for employees from various equity-seeking groups to really connect, to network, but also importantly, advocate for their needs and interests that the company may not be responding to or aware of. And I think ERG can also provide valuable feedback and insights to organizational leadership as they are developing their EDI practices and initiatives as they're moving along their diversity journey. And so, an employee resource group can, it promotes inclusive leadership that I was speaking about earlier by creating really safe and supportive space for employees from diverse backgrounds to connect with each other. So, an organization could establish an ERG for employees who identify as LGBTQIA+ to come together, discuss their experiences, share resources, and really advocate for policies that promote equity and inclusion. And so through these ERGs, the employees can provide even really critical feedback and insights to organizational leadership and EDI practices I mentioned, and these can help to shape a more responsive and inclusive organizational culture and shift policies. And this in turn can really foster a really critical component of EDI work is belonging and then of course inclusion from folks who are from equity seeking groups. And of course that would overall contribute to the organization's growth and success. And we've seen a myriad of case studies that demonstrated that diversity and inclusion and belonging really contribute to overall organizational growth and effectiveness.
Thank you so much. There's a lot in that statement that I'm sure we're going to tease out as we move forward. So our second question, Sharon, this one is for you. What is the difference between meaningful and performative action? How can organizations go from surface level equity commitments towards sustainable change?
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you, Sarana. You're a hard act to follow, but I will do my very best here. So I think the first and most important way for me to give an understanding about how I approach a question like that is by sort of stating my approach and my team's approach at Quake Lab and how we see this work. And so two sort of things are key here to understand. As you mentioned in your bio, which for the record, I love bios because I get to sit here and pretend like I didn't write that whole thing on my own and just say like, oh, wow, that's lovely. I've never known these things about myself. Thank you so much. But I think it's important to mention that like we focus in the equity and justice space, which doesn't mean that we disregard diversity, inclusion, belonging, and all of the important aspects of that. But equity and justice really changes the positionality of how we do the work and the approach, because we're focused on course correction and we're focused on a systemic analysis. And so the second piece there is also just leaning more towards systems change than behavior change when it comes to the work we do. And so in approaching the question of the difference between meaningful and performative and what that looks like, I wanted to touch on 4 key elements here. The first was identifying the challenge. So often what we come across is scenarios by which folks are starting at a solution before they are very clear about a problem. We often talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice, accessibility as the problem. Folks say we have a diversity problem, whereas diversity isn't your problem. There is a need to be very strategic and very systematic about what exactly are we talking about here. And that makes it so that your next steps become justice focused. So rather than saying we have a DEI problem or we have a DEI, initiative, you start talking about, well, we have a problem with discrepancies in pay. We have rates of mobility that, are different depending on gender and race and ability. We have this, so it becomes very specific. And I think that's going to be the difference between performative and meaningful, where performative brings this idea that this is more of a kumbaya exercise where our general problem is humanity, and so our general solution is just whatever feels right in that moment. And sort of relating to that, my second point is that clear action. When you have a lot of clarity around the problem that you are looking at, then you have a lot of clarity about what action is required. So I'll go back to the example where when you're getting specific and you have done the work, for instance, to assess pay transparency and pay inequity, for instance. And we find, and I say give this example because we do a lot of this work in getting very specific and pulling from data. I might come to your organization and say, hey, you seem to have quite a bit of gender parity in your organization, which is wonderful. But from what we've seen in our disaggregated analysis is that the women of color in your organization predominantly exists only in the most junior roles. And also the Indigenous women in your organization are making, 62 cents on the dollar, which actually I think is the number, 62 cents on the dollar here. It's very hard for you to then say, oh, wow, that's really fascinating. Perhaps what we can do is host a town hall where we talk about the importance of diversity. Because I am so specific in the challenge here, you are then forced to be very specific in your action and say, okay, we need to develop some systems for pay transparency and pay equity. And also we need to pay Indigenous women in our organization more. Like that forces you to be very, very to take very meaningful action and really move away from performative action. The third thing is the alignment with systemic analysis. This is a tricky one for, I think, myself and also for a lot of people, and I'll explain a little bit further. So within our approach, what I do with my strong but very mighty team, we have kind of a analogy that I use often, which is that when you're doing systems change work, it's a lot like a moving train. Within that, you think of a moving train, a train has its schedule, it has its stops, it's on a track, it's going where it's going, right? We do not pay too much mind, for instance, if there's someone outside who's saying, oh, well, can the train stop until I really understand how the engine works? Or someone is, well, I don't know, I'm sort of 1 foot in the train, 1 foot out. We are empathetic and compassionate to those folks, but this train has a stop, this train has a schedule. With systemic change, you're really focused on understanding that marginalized people have been asked to wait and pause for a really, really long time in order to have significant and impactful change. And we are hesitant, and we will always be hesitant to stop in order to say, oh, well, Bob doesn't understand what exactly transgender means. So let's pause all work until we feel like that knowledge has been captured. We just can't we just can't prioritize that. What we're looking for is that really systemic analysis that allows for us to prioritize that type of impactful change. And so that's what I mean between the alignment with systemic analysis. When you have performative action, it is often devoid of that through line. Whereas, for instance, when you can sort of see that dog whistle with performative action because it leans more towards this is better. We are stronger with diversity. We're looking to do better, and all that. It's so devoid from the reason we got here, because when we talk about inequity, when we're talking about this very subject matter, you need to come to this space understanding that we are here not out of someone just had a hobby that they wanted to expand throughout the world, or it's an interesting topic, but we are talking about historical injustice and historic inequity, and that is rooted in that systemic inequity, and we need to root our action in that, and that becomes that difference between performative and meaningful. Lastly, and I think this is going to be This is going to be a little spicy, but then again, I think I've created a solid background of being a bit spicy, so I'm okay with it. An important aspect for me and for my team, and I'd like to say for a lot of people who do this excellent work when thinking about meaningful versus performative action, is also that differentiation between, again, systems and systematic change and emotive. So I want to caveat this by saying there is nothing wrong with being emotive. There is nothing wrong with, really, I think, being aligned with how things make you feel, being embodied in what how discrimination, how racism, how sexism, how transphobia makes you feel. I think that's a really, really critical aspect of being human and of understanding, what ways you're required to heal and the types of accommodation you as an individual need. However, I think one of the most pervasive and also nefarious aspects of how we have seen DEI as an industry, as a practice, and as a profession has captured is this idea that when we are talking about doing this work, we are essentially talking about an emotive process or a matter of how people feel. Let me explain that further. There's this idea that racism is a feeling. So when people say, I want you to feel good about being here, I do not want you to feel discriminated against. Now, that is not to say that is not 100% right. Like there's definitely, in moments when I have been discriminated, I have felt things. Let me not disparage that. But when we place that, when folks who are in decision-making positions and who are making calls about what to do next, when they are leaning on this idea, this nefarious idea that what we are dealing with is an emotive process, it leaves a lot of room for that objectivity about how to make you feel less discriminated, how to make this feel not transphobic. Whereas the meaningful action is recognizing that this is not a matter of you feeling away, because again, that places the burden of proof and also the burden of change on the person who is feeling discriminated against, rather than recognizing that no, we are working in systems and structures. Is that fantastic saying that like you don't need a racist person to have a racist room, right? It's not about how I as an individual feel. It is about systems and structures that have made it so that my ability to navigate this space is inherently in peril and inherently different and inherently inequitable, not because of my race, but because of the racism that has been inbuilt into the system. That's all I'll say there.
Oh, we could go into that. And I am mindful of our time, but thank you for bringing that analysis into focus for us, because I completely agree. We, while I share your point around the emotive piece of this, we're also looking at it from the place of the issue isn't I feel discriminated against. The issue is I am, and this is happening. So with that in mind, Sarana, what advice do you have for employers evaluating their current equity initiatives? What metrics and feedback, review or measurement models provide the most insight and enable ongoing improvements?
Thank you. I think it's important, when you look about there's been this whole big growth industry around DEI professionals and organizations rushing to put things in place. Evaluation is going to be key to see what is the impact. They really should take a comprehensive approach, and that should include assessing policies, practices, and organizational culture. So there's a number of steps that I want to talk about that employers can take in evaluating their current initiatives. I think one of the critical things is an equity audit. And this is an equity audit is really a comprehensive review of all of the organization policies, all its practices, all the culture that has built over the years to identify areas that are strong, the areas of strength, and also opportunities for improvement. And this can be done by collecting data on, demographics, employee experiences, and organizational practices. It really is an important step. So for example, as I mentioned, they collect employee demographic data like race, gender, age, disability status. This would help them to better understand the diversity makeup of their workforce. But they also need to collect data on employee experiences, right? We talk about, what Sharon just mentioned about that you experience racism, and really that's important, not just to practice. And of course, in the organizational practice. And this data can then identify areas of underrepresentation within the organization, and to help the organization to set better diverse EDI goals. The second thing that they have to do is really solicit and evaluate feedback from employees. They should regularly collect that feedback on their experience with the equity initiatives that are currently in place, that are being rolled out. And this can be done through a myriad of ways. They can do surveys, focus groups, or a one-on-one conversations to give people different avenues to share. And they should also really, as they collect this feedback, they really should encourage employees to report incidents of discrimination or bias that they've had. And this feedback can be used to identify areas where employees feel that the organization is doing well with the equity initiatives, and areas where improvements can be made, or even gaps that the organization may be unaware of. Another important thing that needs to be done is for employees to regularly review their policies and their practices to identify areas where they may be unintentionally excluding or even disadvantaging certain groups. For example, they could review, look at the HR practice around recruitment and selection and the hiring practices to ensure that those practices are inclusive and unbiased. And that could start as simply from the job posting that really signals to participants these various steps that the organization will be taking, for example, to accommodate them if they have issues around mobility issues that needs to be accommodated, or if they the adjustment of the interview practices to support them. They also need to track diversity metrics. You can't just do these things without measuring. It's what you say, what gets measured, get done. So they should really track diversity metrics such as representation rates, retention rates. So you made a big push in the last year, 2020, we had a global uprising and awareness because of the murder of George Floyd, and everybody was interested in anti-Black racism and having more Black folks in the organization. It's 2023. What's the retention rate of those Black folks that you brought in? What's the promotion rate of those Black folks into leadership positions? And that would allow them to assess the impact of these equity initiatives on the workforce. And these metrics can be broken down by demographics such as race, gender, age, and those are critical pieces to do the measurement. And Sharon talked about pay earlier. They kind of conduct pay equity analysis. Even if you're not legislated to do it, you should do it, right? Pay equity analysis to really ensure that employees are paid fairly, regardless of the demographics. And this can, involve comparing salaries by job title and level, as well as analyzing bonuses and commissions and other forms of compensation to ensure that they're equitable and fair. And then monitoring progress over time. Are we moving the dial? They should regularly review these initiatives and track progress. So setting goals and benchmarks for improvement, and regularly reporting on progress to organizational leadership and the employee base, so we can see what has been done and the impact of that. So I want to talk about equity audit. I can give an example of how an equity audit might be conducted in practice. So folks who say, "Ooh, I don't know what that is, and how do I do it?" Let's say you're a large technology company in the Kitchener-Waterloo corridor, and you want to do an equity audit to evaluate your current equity initiatives. So the first thing the company needs to do is start by collecting demographic data on its workforce. So like race, gender, age, disability status, for example. And as they're collecting that data and they're doing this audit, they may discover that while the company's overall workforce is diverse, certain groups are underrepresented in leadership roles. Next, the company can do a series of focus groups to collect feedback from employees on their experiences with equity initiatives. And that feedback could reveal that employees from underrepresented groups often feel excluded from important decision-making processes. They may face subtle forms of biases in the day-to-day work. And then the company could review its organizational practice, where it could try to identify areas for improvement. And they could then discover, recruitment and hiring practices may be unintentionally biased against certain groups. So for example, the job descriptions like I talked about earlier, it may use gendered language that discourages women from applying into the technology space. And so based on the findings of this equity audit, the company could now say, you know what, we need to redevelop our equity practice, and they could use a series of recommendations for improving its equity initiatives. And these recommendations may include setting diversity goals for leadership roles. It may be implementing bias training for managers. It could also be reviewing and revising their recruitment and hiring practices to ensure that they are inclusive on bias, right? So to enable ongoing improvement, employers they need a combination of quantitative and qualitative measures to evaluate the equity initiative. It's not just about workshops and talk. They need data. They need to collect data on diversity metrics, representation rates, as I mentioned, retention rates, feedback from folks, review the practices, and then go about making those changes. So this requires comprehensive, but more critically, ongoing approach to evaluating equity initiatives. And so through all that, quantitative and qualitative data gathering, but of course, it's critical that the employees are engaged throughout each step of the process. I think organizations can build more inclusive and equitable workplace cultures.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate the understanding of it, of the journey of it. It is not a one and done. It is not, we did a series of workshops or lectures, or we did this training one time and everyone's good now. That retention metric, that consistent pulse survey and analysis of that data, I view as fundamental in this larger discussion for folks who are interested in how do we move the words off the page, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Sharon, given that and your experience in the space, why do you feel that some JEDI initiatives fail to make a real difference? Can you identify some critical gaps, constraints, challenges to seeing results in this work? Why is workplace bias so sticky and pervasive? And what do organization leaders and HR practitioners need to prioritize to overcome these issues and authentically advance and champion equitable working environments?
Oh, you're throwing me a big one there, but I'll do my very best.
Go ahead and fix it all for us.
Yeah, let me just wrap it up. Everyone can be done for the day. I do want to say that it's very interesting that you spoke about equity audits, because that is a huge critical part of what we do, and we have taken a lot of time, and we continue to take a lot of time to internally assess every aspect of our equity audit process, because we need it to be so rigorous that we can say with like full confidence and full force, yes, this is the right thing to do. Because for folks like myself, we must be consistently critical of the fact that this work that we're doing is now essentially an industry, a money-making industry, and we must always be sort of self-reflective of like, am I doing what I am doing because it is like, the basis of business is making a profit, or because I actually think this is going to be a significant way to do this work and make impact. So I appreciate you talking equity audits. Now, in terms of the very upbeat question of why things fail, let me be the fun one in the room who tells you a little bit about failure. So there's going to be some overlap between my me speaking to that performative and meaningful action, because I think there is naturally overlap. But I wanted to cover a few areas that I think are really critical to look into, and hopefully go in a way that is easy to follow. So the first, and for me really important aspect, is again echoing that question around identifying a challenge, is clarity about what you're doing and why. I think it's wonderful and it's lovely to hear folks say we are doing this because it's the right thing to do. I think that's solid reasoning. That being said, we could say that about just about anything in the world, right? If I ask you today, why does the YWCA exist? You'll say it's the right thing to do. But the YWCA also has a pretty specific reason why they do what they do, right? And so I think this entails the same sort of rigor and self-analysis to ask, well, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this work? And what do we expect is going to be the outcome of it? And it feels almost, unnecessary because it seems almost common sense, but that is, I think, a critical missing piece, because often if you are not thinking clearly, critically, and rigorously about why this work is here, you're going to leave a lot of room for one hand failure, for the other hand so much ambiguity that you will be able to call just about anything success, which to me is almost as scary as failure. Diving into it a bit more, and again, perhaps this is just my this is my load to bear today, to be a little bit spicy, like I said earlier. And I think where we see these initiatives failing are whereas there's a lack of understanding that systemic problems require systemic solutions. Now, I say this is going to be a bit spicy because I am essentially going to come up against one of the most used and most recognized tools of this work, which is behavior change, the behavior change approach. And that captures things like unconscious bias training, DEI training, and in general sort of knowledge building apparatus or knowledge building tools within this space. Now, the reason why I say this is an area where we see a point, where that flags to us that this is probably why this initiative isn't doing as well as folks would like it to, or it is probably not going to succeed, is because, once again, when you are focused on systemic problems, when you are talking about pay, when you are talking about recruitment, when you are talking about even just outside of the HR realm, program design, service design, communications, financial planning, all of that. These are structures, and within the structures, systems are inequitable. Now, if you then have the almost flagship aspect of your plan or your strategy is focused on knowledge building, there is going to be a conflict here. And I can put it this way. If I was a financial consultant and I came to an organization, did an audit and said, okay, what I'm finding is pretty alarming. Every, February, right before fiscal end of year, $2 million disappears from your budget. And I say this and it's jarring for everyone to hear. And you're all, oh my goodness, that's awful. We have to figure something out. And then a loud voice in the back of the room says, okay, we're going to put some budget aside for an hour-long session on unconscious stealing. And then that's what we're going to do. Now, that is a systems level problem in which we are trying to attack it with solely a behavioral solution. Now, I don't know if there's any such thing as unconscious stealing sessions, but this is not to say I don't want to say there is no place for training, but the problem is, again, you start with that level of why are we doing this? What is the problem? And then we're trying to look for a systems level solution. But then when you bring in a behavioral solution that's based around the idea of knowledge building, it becomes really problematic. And for a few reasons, we have painfully little research around the efficacy of unconscious bias training and similar DEI trainings. But what we have seen is far across the board. Best case scenario, they might, someone might learn something great and they might, come out there with some knowledge or some learning. It is shown to have almost very little effect on sort of the systemic structure of an institution or organization. But on the other end of the spectrum, what we've seen is instances of things like something called, you'd actually alluded to it earlier, and it's called moral licensing. This idea of like, oh, I've done the thing, so we're good. Like there's really nothing more to do here. And in some instances, we've even seen rates of mobility for specific groups of people, like people of color, in which the training is specifically focused on, reduce. And a big part of that is the second challenge here, which is, regardless of your intention, a lot of the time, the way these sessions are focused, you're bringing folks into the room, sometimes folks who are marginalized, and then you are talking to them about all of the ways in which stereotypes have been placed upon them, all of the ways in which their colleagues think of them negatively, all of the ways in which, just these heavy topics. And the way the brain works is it's not always going to, get into the example of, let's get into an anti-Black racism session, unconscious bias session, and the facilitator saying, there's stereotypes around Black people being lazy and and these are wrong, and Black people are not lazy. This is built on this historical precedence, all very valuable. Then 3 weeks later, everyone came out feeling really knowledgeable and piping like, yeah, we have to fight anti-Black racism. And I sit in front of my manager, who maybe actually hasn't worked very closely with me at all, and they're having to make some pretty significant decisions about my performance with almost zero to no knowledge. And unfortunately, our brains are beautiful things, but they're also not always perfect in the way they line up information. And they're like, well, I don't know much about Sharon. And then suddenly like, maybe it feels like maybe she's a little bit lazy. I'm not 100% sure here. And then we start seeing those rates of mobility. Now that, again, we have very painfully little research on the efficacy of unconscious bias. So again, take these things with a grain of salt, and that they're based in very small sample sizes. But these are the kinds of things that we try and avoid. The one thing we have seen anecdotally, we do not have, like I said, big bodies of research for it, is just the challenge of putting marginalized folks in a room and making them have to hear all of these really rough things about how the world perceives them, the challenges that they know. So at worst, it's like, yes, I know, welcome to an average Tuesday. But also at worst, it's sort of like, this is very uncomfortable. This is a space. These are not my friends. These are not my close confidants. They're my colleagues. And this is very uncomfortable. And in the worst types of training I've seen, there is this moment where they're forced to carry the burden of proof, where the facilitator might say something that's sort of like, does anyone have anything to share? And it becomes this moment of, let me lay my most traumatic experiences out so I can prove to you that this thing exists and this thing has happened. Or worse, maybe not worse, or similar, let me try and placate this room of people so that they feel that, no, so these things happen, but not here. You're all very nice. Let me try and soften the blow. And again, in these moments, even if you have the most powerful session, everyone comes out of there feeling invigorated and they've learned two things and it's been wonderful. Even marginalized people have felt good about what was in that room. What then happens? Where is the through line between that session for an hour or 3 hours once a year and the systemic issues that exist? So it's, again, that disconnection between systemic challenges and systemic solutions versus systemic challenges and behavioral solutions. We have seen over and over and over again, folks experience the most nefarious and the most life impactful forms of discrimination, inequity, oppression, not necessarily because of a lack of knowledge, not because someone didn't know, but because systems that are maintained to ensure that this discrimination, this oppression stays strong regardless of intention, regardless of who is in the room. And lastly, and very quickly, okay, I thought that's about as much as I was going to say to disrupt people and make you upset, but I'm going to go for one more, just, while I'm on a roll. Another one that I think is a good indicator that there might be failure in the distance is an obsessive focus on diversification alone. So the challenge with this one is that I think, tech. Across tech in the last few months, we've seen either complete folks being let go of, or freezes on hiring. And I think that's a really great example where if your core strategy around equity work is diversification, meaning hiring as many folks who come from different communities as possible, what happens when you're not hiring? Is that your entire plan? So then nothing happens because there's no one new coming. And also most organizations, most institutions, myself included, we hire once every 722 years, right? And so this influx that we are envisioning happening is actually in reality not going to happen. Maybe you're going to hire one person this year, maybe 2 people in 3 years. And so this effort to really diversify the organization, absolutely, but realistically cannot be it's not your silver bullet. But also there's two other areas here that are important around the question of diversification. The first is, I'm not going to talk much on it because it's not science. It's truly just through experience. We have a saying, Black folks have a saying that I love. It's short and sweet and disaster inducing. All skin folk aren't kinfolk, right? there's that idea, like, by virtue of a person being a person of color or just someone who has is from marginalized communities, doesn't mean they're inherently going to radically change a place for all of the other people. Like, in fact, it can look the opposite. I mean, while I'm being difficult, let's look at the UK. We have a person of color at the helms, but I don't know if people are going to necessarily fare better because of that, right? And then the other less just Sharon being difficult reason is around this idea. There's, when we're talking about the world of work, there's inherently a problem with the idea that a marginalized body is everything you need in order to make systematic change or systemic change, right? Because one, identity is not a prerequisite for impact, and two, identity is not inherently skill or expertise, right? And on the side of like what they're able to do, that is deeply unfair, but also on the side of just thinking really practically around things like compensation. If you are bringing folks in and they have their job, description, you're hiring a finance manager, but you're like, oh, but she's Black and trans. So there's your job description, and then there's your job description, the unsaid one, where you're gonna do the equity stuff too, right? But because it's unsaid, A, we don't know if they're equipped to do this work or if they have any interest. B, they're not being compensated for it. So the hope is that this very body is either inherently going to do this work or explicitly going to do this work without compensation. And so diversification becomes more problematic than not. And there's also the final question of, sure, you want to just bring in everyone from everywhere in, but what are you bringing them into? And so a good indicator for this work or initiatives that aren't going to fail is one that is hinged on not just the knowledge building of the most privileged, but also just the diversification as a silver bullet. And then the last one, I promise, this one is not too heavy. Two things. Lack of resources is often a good indicator. And by resources here, I don't just mean money. I mean money, time, and labor or expertise. If there is an initiative that doesn't take into account that this is going to require resources, there's very little chance that this is going to succeed. And it's okay. I know you might not have all of the cash in the world, but that doesn't mean you still shouldn't put resources into it. Add it into your budget, plan for it. Kind of if one person in your team is taking it on, understand that they might have to reduce the load of their other work, understand that you might have to upskill them for them to do this. The resources will be required. And finally, just to echo what was said earlier, measurement. If you are being clear about the problems you are solving, clear about the actions you are taking, logic demands that you will also have a really strong runway to figure out what will it take to do this work. I am deeply apologetic. I have gone very much ahead of time, and I know we had some questions here, so I want to, let's just say this was African time and quickly move forward. Thank you so much.
Please do not apologize. And thank you for sharing all of that with us. And yes, the idea here is this is contentious work, folks. Like we are up against the very embodied feelings. We're up against folks where you're coming at it from intention and practicality, available resources, and the outcome, right? There's a lot that's mixed in there, and to tease out into deliverable change, tangible change, takes a huge amount of intention, right? And that's what I've really appreciated from both of you today, is hearing the importance of the systems level, the data tracking, the fact that it is more than having a celebration calendar, and all of the pieces that we do with good intention, but don't lead to the kinds of results that people need. Okay, so I knew an hour wasn't enough for this one, but let's do what we can with what we've got. We've got some questions in the Q&A that I hope we're able to get to. I'm going to pose this to both of you, so whoever wants to take a crack at it, go for it. So what methodology and tools do you use to collect AEDI organizational metrics and data?
I can jump in. I think if we start off with methodologies, I mentioned some of the things in terms of collecting earlier surveys. So conducting anonymous surveys among employees and stakeholders to gather data, interviews and focus group, being mindful of time, document analysis, observations. I think that's critical. And observation means observing and documenting the organization's practices and behaviors related to EDI, such as hiring practices, promotions, ERG groups, training programs. So those are methodologies. In terms of tools, HRI systems. So we use the HRI system to track and analyze EDI data, such as diversity of new hires, promotions, terminations, retention rates. Data visualization software, utilizing data visualization software to present EDI data in like a really user-friendly, easy to understand way, like charts, graphs, and dashboards are really quite effective. There's also diversity and inclusion scorecards that could be used. So using scorecards to track and measure the organization progress towards the EDI goals and objectives are really key. And then the training program. So you implement D&I training programs to educate employees in EDI topics, and that encourages behavioral change. And then the training program should include an evaluation component that, to allow you to measure the effectiveness of the training and to identify shifts in behaviors in the organization. So those are some of the tools and methodologies that could be employed and to help measure the work that you're doing.
Thank you for that. Okay, our next question, and my apologies, this question was asked in French. I've had it translated, and our interpreter will translate my answer. The question here is, can the actions you have proposed be applied in the community setting, organizations that do not have human resources or funding for EDI support?
I mean, if Sharon wants to say, I lead a nonprofit and we are poor, so we don't have all the money to do all these fancy things, but you do what you need to do. Leaders take on the role. We have in-kind contributions. So for example, with board members and their organizations and their experts to provide support to us. And we are a relatively large nonprofit. We are over 100 employees, but we don't have a lot of these resources to invest in an EDI professional. So in-kind support, but also writing grants to get specialized funding to help develop programs to deliver. Train managers going out and getting training and bringing it back as train the trainer to help build capacity has been ways in which, as we built our HR team and our practice, allowed us to build an anti-oppression framework in the organization. And it's an ongoing work, but I don't think you want to ever say, well, we don't have funding for it, therefore we can't do it. You can always get in-kind support. Collaborative organizations such as umbrella organizations that your organization may belong to that have support that you could access. Going to corporations and their leadership team and asking them to give a day of sharing of the expertise to help you build your competencies in your organization is all really quite critical as you move along your EDI journey. We cannot use the limitations of finances as a reason not to work towards anti-oppression and anti-racism work.
Thank you for that. Sadly, we're close to close. So my apologies for the questions we did not get to, but thank you both for this incredibly thought-provoking discussion. There's so much here to consider, and I would really love a magical wand to turn back the clock so we can continue to get into it. I do want to urge folks that this is the beginning of a conversation, not the conversation. So, what you've heard today, there are additional resources and learning materials provided in your follow-up email. And I do encourage you to use what you've heard today as sparks to continue the work. I'm so grateful to you, Sharon and Sarana, for your incredible insights and expertise, and to everyone who made the time to join us today. Clearly, this is just the beginning of a much needed journey. I want to thank my colleagues, Jessica Perrin and Jolene Joseph at YWCA Canada for making today and our entire Synergy Speakers series possible. They are legends. Our incomparable tech support and interpretation team for always holding us together, and our funder, the Future Skills Center, for their generous support of this project. But most importantly, I want to thank the women and gender diverse people who continue to shape YWCA Canada's work in advocating for equitable employment and economic opportunity. This work is based on the research that we conducted in community, and I am so grateful for the people who lent us their stories, their expertise, their wisdom, and their patience to gather what employment looks like in their shoes. You can find more resources and information at ywcacanada.ca/move forward. And please stay tuned for future work in this area. You'll see a feedback survey pop up on your screen at the close of this, and really, please, oh gosh, please fill it out. This is how we know what we're doing well, what we need to get better, how we can structure for future sessions. We build for you folks. So if you tell us, we will do our best to incorporate and redefine. Thank you all for giving us part of your day. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Take care.